Washington, D.C. is often remembered as the city of power, politics, and monuments carved from stone. It is a place where history is preserved in marble and authority feels permanent. Yet beneath that carefully maintained image exists a darker layer, one rarely revisited and even less often discussed. Between 1971 and 1972, 6 young girls disappeared from ordinary places that were supposed to be safe. Sidewalks, playgrounds, bus stops, and neighborhood streets became points of rupture. Some of those girls would never come home. Others left behind fragments so unsettling that investigators still debate their meaning decades later. This was not simply a series of crimes. It became an unsolved mystery, a cold case that exposed fear, racial tension, and institutional silence at the heart of the nation's capital. Tonight, we step back into that shadow, into a story where the killer was never named, and the freeway kept its secrets. In the early 1970s, Washington, D.C. lived in a state of quiet tension that rarely appeared in official speeches or glossy tourist brochures. The city was still carrying the psychological weight of recent political assassinations, widespread protests, and deep racial division. Power was concentrated in grand buildings, but fear flowed through ordinary streets, unnoticed and unmanaged. Economic disparity shaped daily life. Many neighborhoods struggled with underfunded schools, limited police presence, and crumbling infrastructure. Trust in institutions was fragile, particularly among black communities who had learned, through experience, that protection was not always guaranteed. Violence was not constant, but uncertainty was. It settled into daily routines like background noise, rarely acknowledged, always present. By daylight, Washington, D.C. looked functional, even familiar. Children walked to school in groups. Local stores opened early. Neighbors greeted one another on stoops and sidewalks. Life appeared stable enough to continue as usual. Yet when evening approached, the city changed its tone. Streetlights flickered on, and shadows stretched longer than they should have. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It seeped in. Children still played outside during afternoons, their laughter bouncing off row houses and narrow alleys. Parents watched from windows, believing proximity equaled safety. Familiar routes felt reliable. Familiar faces felt trustworthy. These assumptions were not careless. They were necessary for survival in communities that relied on mutual recognition and shared responsibility. But something invisible had already entered the city's rhythm. Someone was paying attention. Someone was not rushing. This presence did not disrupt routines. It studied them. It learned which streets emptied first, which houses stayed quiet, which children walked alone, and which errands repeated themselves every week without change. This was not chaos. This was patience. The victims were 6 African-American girls, between the ages of 10 and 18. They were not statistics or symbols at the time they lived. They were daughters expected home for dinner, sisters asked to help with chores, students navigating adolescence under pressure. Their lives were ordinary in the most human and intimate sense. They attended school with worn textbooks and crowded classrooms. They ran errands because their families depended on them. They watched younger siblings while parents worked long hours. Their responsibilities matured them early, but they still carried simple hopes that reflected resilience rather than ambition. One dreamed of becoming a nurse after watching relatives struggle with illness. She believed care was a form of strength. Another hoped to teach children one day, seeing education as a way out of limitation rather than fame. Others did not articulate careers at all. They simply wanted to grow older without fear, to reach adulthood intact, in a city that had already demanded too much of them. What binds these girls most painfully is not the way they died, but the way they lived. They disappeared while doing things they had done hundreds of times before, walking home from school, going to the store, helping their families. These routines did not mark them as reckless. They marked them as dependable. Routine created predictability. Predictability created exposure. Exposure became vulnerability. From an investigative standpoint, this pattern is critical. The offender did not need to chase. He waited. He inserted himself into moments that felt ordinary. The absence of immediate struggle or alarm suggests he approached calmly, possibly using authority, familiarity, or reassurance. Children often comply with adults who appear composed and confident, especially within environments where trust is culturally reinforced. No suspect was ever arrested. No definitive face emerged from lineups or public appeals. No single narrative satisfied the questions left behind. Yet the consistency of the crimes suggested intention rather than randomness. The offender demonstrated patience, geographical familiarity, and emotional control. Psychologically, this profile points away from impulsivity. This was not someone acting out of sudden rage or disorganized aggression. This was someone capable of delaying gratification, managing risk, and blending into social environments without attracting suspicion. He understood the unspoken rules of the community, particularly the assumption that danger comes from outside rather than within. The absence of a visible suspect created a disturbing paradox. The killer felt omnipresent yet untraceable. He did not resemble the imagined monster. He did not announce himself. This forced a shift in perception that deeply unsettled the city. Parents no longer feared only strangers. They began to question familiarity itself. The neighbor who lingered too long on the sidewalk, the adult who offered help too readily, the face that appeared kind instead of threatening. Ordinary gestures became unsettling. Trust weakened, and suspicion crept inward. The danger no longer felt external. It felt embedded within everyday life, quietly reshaping how families viewed safety in one another. These neighborhoods were working-class communities shaped by endurance rather than comfort. Generations lived close together, bound by routine, shared labor, and mutual dependence. People relied on one another not because of idealism, but because survival required cooperation. When resources were limited and institutions felt distant, trust within the community became a form of protection. Parents believed their children were safer precisely because everyone recognized everyone else. A familiar face meant accountability. A known name meant reassurance. This belief was not careless or uninformed. It was foundational to how these neighborhoods functioned day after day. Without that trust, daily life would have been impossible, and that trust was quietly exploited. The most dangerous illusion was not darkness or physical isolation. It was familiarity itself. The threat did not emerge from abandoned buildings alone, or from strangers lurking at the edges of society. It moved comfortably through ordinary spaces, blending into routines that felt harmless. Sidewalks, corner stores, and familiar routes became points of vulnerability. The secret did not live in shadows. It lived inside what appeared safe, ordinary, and reliable. That realization altered the city's emotional landscape. Washington, D.C. lost more than 6 young lives. It lost the sense of certainty about where danger begins and where safety ends. Once that boundary dissolves, fear no longer needs darkness to exist. Each disappearance began without noise, without witnesses, and without any immediate signal that something irreversible had occurred. There were no alarms raised in the moment, no frantic phone calls, no sudden chaos. The girls simply failed to arrive where they were expected. Absence announced itself quietly, and silence delayed fear. The last people to see the victims were often those closest to them. A neighbor who watched a girl walk down the street, a friend who said goodbye after school, a family member who assumed she would return within minutes. These final sightings carried no urgency because nothing about them appeared unusual. There were no visible threats, no raised voices, and no signs of force. In several cases, witnesses recalled seeing the girl speaking casually with someone shortly before they vanished. The interaction did not register as dangerous. It did not interrupt routine. It blended into the background of everyday life. That detail, often overlooked at first, became one of the most significant behavioral indicators in the case. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, this suggests the offender did not rely on overt intimidation. He did not need to chase or overpower. Instead, he likely presented himself as approachable and non-threatening. Authority may have been implied rather than enforced. Familiarity may have been suggested rather than proven. Kindness, or the appearance of it, functioned as a tool. Children are particularly susceptible to adults who appear calm, confident, and helpful. In communities where cooperation is a survival mechanism, politeness and compliance are often taught early. An adult who speaks gently, offers assistance, or claims legitimacy can bypass a child's instinctive caution without resistance. The disappearances unfolded over more than a year. They were not clustered tightly enough to provoke immediate recognition of a serial pattern. Time passed between each case, allowing fear to dissipate slightly before returning in another form. Yet when viewed together, the similarities were undeniable. This spacing reflects a level of restraint uncommon in impulsive offenders. Spacing crimes over time reduces exposure and allows emotional regulation. It suggests the offender was capable of controlling urges rather than being driven solely by them. This capacity points toward a personality structured around patience, planning, and risk management, rather than disorganization or frenzy. When bodies were eventually discovered, they were often located near highways, abandoned structures, or secluded areas with minimal foot traffic. These locations were not random. They indicate a working knowledge of the city's geography and its blind spots. The offender knew where visibility dropped, where surveillance was absent, and where time worked in his favor. Highways, in particular, hold symbolic and practical significance. They allow rapid movement and anonymity. They blur jurisdictional boundaries. They complicate timelines. Leaving victims near such areas suggests an understanding of how investigations unfold and where they falter. The violence itself, as reconstructed from available records, was restrained rather than excessive. There was no evidence of theatrical cruelty or chaotic escalation. This restraint is psychologically meaningful. It suggests emotional detachment, compartmentalization, and a focus on outcome rather than expression. Violence driven by rage often leaves disorder behind. Violence driven by control tends to erase itself. In this case, the latter appears more consistent. The offender acted with intention, not explosion. The goal was not spectacle, it was dominance without exposure. In several instances, families delayed reporting their daughters missing. This delay has often been misunderstood or unfairly judged. In reality, it reflects the social and institutional context of the time. Many families believed the girls would return. Some had run errands before and come back late. Others stayed with friends without notice. There was also fear. Fear of not being taken seriously. Fear of being blamed. Fear rooted in past experiences with authorities who dismissed concerns or responded slowly. Reporting a missing child was not always met with urgency, particularly in marginalized communities. When police were eventually notified, the investigation faced immediate obstacles. Scenes were sometimes unsecured. Evidence was lost, contaminated, or misinterpreted. Witness memories shifted as time passed, influenced by suggestion, fear, and the natural erosion of recall. These investigative failures were not solely the result of indifference. They stemmed from systemic limitations, fragmented coordination, and the absence of modern forensic science. DNA analysis was not yet available, and communication between departments remained inconsistent. Each delay weakened the next step forward. Then came the letters. The offender crossed a psychological threshold, choosing partial visibility. Handwritten notes reached police, controlled and ambiguous in tone, not to explain, but to announce his presence. From a psychological perspective, this act reveals a complex internal conflict. The offender wanted acknowledgement without accountability. He wanted to be recognized as intelligent, powerful, and untouchable. At the same time, he avoided revealing details that would lead directly to his capture. This behavior is consistent with individuals who experience deep internal inadequacy or unresolved humiliation. Control becomes a compensatory mechanism. By manipulating the investigation, the offender reclaimed a sense of superiority that reality may have denied him elsewhere. The letters also served another function. They prolonged the crime psychologically. Even after physical acts ended, communication allowed the offender to relive dominance. Each response from police, each media mention, reinforced his relevance. Yet the letters stopped. Whether due to fear, satisfaction, or external change remains unknown. What remains is the question they left behind. Did the killer want to be stopped, seeking recognition through capture and consequence? Or did he want to demonstrate that he could never be found, that systems designed to protect could be manipulated and outpaced? That distinction matters deeply. It speaks to motive, identity, and internal fracture. One reflects a desire for resolution. The other reflects a desire for permanence through absence. In the case of the Freeway Phantom, the silence that followed suggests the latter. The crimes did not end with an arrest. They faded into uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, the offender achieved what he may have wanted most: to exist without a name, without a face, and without consequence, leaving only questions in his place. The initial investigation into the Freeway Phantom killings was marked by fragmentation from the very beginning. Responsibility shifted between different police units, each handling portions of the case without a unified strategy. Information was collected in pieces rather than as a whole, and those pieces rarely aligned in time. Leads were followed inconsistently, often depending on which department happened to receive them first. This lack of coordination had consequences that could not be undone. In the early 1970s, investigative work relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. Physical evidence gathered at the scene, and handwritten records. There was no centralized digital database, no real-time sharing of information, and no standardized method for cross-referencing patterns across jurisdictions. A missed connection in one office could disappear entirely in another. Several individuals were questioned over the course of the investigation. Some had criminal histories involving violence or sexual offenses. Others lived or worked close to the areas where the girls disappeared or where their bodies were found. In a few cases, suspects matched parts of the emerging behavioral profile, yet none were charged. The reasons varied. Evidence was often circumstantial rather than definitive. Witness accounts were inconsistent or changed over time. Physical evidence was limited, degraded, or improperly preserved. Without DNA profiling or advanced forensic tools, investigators could not conclusively link suspects to the crimes. Suspicion remained just that, suspicion. Premature dismissal also played a role. Some leads were deprioritized because they did not fit prevailing assumptions. Others were dropped due to resource constraints or competing cases. Each decision, reasonable in isolation, collectively weakened the investigation's ability to maintain momentum. Media coverage reflected another layer of systemic failure. Reporting on the disappearances was sporadic and restrained. The victims were young black girls from working-class neighborhoods, and their stories did not dominate headlines for long. National attention moved quickly to other events. Without sustained media pressure, public urgency faded. This absence of visibility compounded the tragedy. Media attention often acts as an informal accountability mechanism, forcing institutions to allocate resources and respond publicly. In this case, silence allowed inertia. The lack of sustained outrage reinforced a painful implication that some lives did not command the same level of concern as others. For the families, time did not ease the loss, it intensified it. Years passed without arrests, explanations, or resolution, leaving grief suspended and unanswered questions growing heavier with every decade. Their grief extended beyond the death of their daughters. It included the erosion of trust in systems meant to protect and the torment of unanswered questions. Psychologically, unresolved loss creates a unique form of trauma. Closure is not simply emotional relief. It is the restoration of narrative coherence, the ability to say what happened, why it happened, and who was responsible. Without that structure, grief remains suspended, constantly reactivated by uncertainty. Over time, several theories emerged to explain the crimes. One of the most persistent suggests the killer was a local resident, someone familiar with the neighborhoods, trusted by the community, and therefore overlooked. This theory aligns with the offender's apparent ease of approach and knowledge of routines. Another theory proposes the involvement of a repeat offender who benefited from institutional failure or bias. According to this view, the system did not merely miss the killer, it enabled him through neglect, underestimation, or discrimination. The lack of urgency and coordination created opportunity. A third theory considers the possibility of multiple perpetrators. While controversial, it attempts to explain subtle differences between cases and inconsistencies in evidence. It suggests that similar social conditions may have produced similar crimes without direct coordination. Each theory carries elements of plausibility and limitation. None fully resolves the contradictions within the case. What remains undeniable is that the investigative system failed to adapt quickly enough to recognize patterns and protect vulnerable individuals. This raises a deeper question. The focus cannot remain solely on identifying who committed these crimes. It must also examine how such crimes were allowed to continue. Systems do not fail suddenly. They erode gradually through inattention, bias, and fragmentation. At a later stage, a new clue emerged that complicated the narrative further. This discovery challenged earlier timelines and geographic assumptions. It also introduced inconsistencies with established psychological profiles. Instead of clarifying the case, it expanded uncertainty. For investigators, this moment underscored a difficult truth. Conclusions built on incomplete foundations are fragile. New information does not always bring resolution. Sometimes it exposes how much was misunderstood from the beginning. The Freeway Phantom case ultimately resists simple explanations. It does not fit comfortably into the familiar narrative of a single, isolated monster hiding in darkness. Instead, it exposes something far more unsettling. The case reveals a convergence between individual pathology and systemic weakness, where personal violence was amplified by institutional failure. The crimes unfolded not only because of one offender's actions, but because gaps in coordination, attention, and protection allowed those actions to continue. In this sense, the mystery is not only about who committed the crimes, but about how vulnerability was repeatedly overlooked. If you were forced to reach a conclusion, how would you interpret these crimes? Would you view them as the work of a single, calculating predator who understood how to exploit trust and avoid detection? Or would you recognize them as signs of a broader collapse in responsibility, where institutional hesitation, fragmented systems, and social neglect slowly accumulated until violence became unavoidable? This question extends beyond logic or evidence alone. It challenges how responsibility is assigned, how vulnerability is valued, and whether failure is seen as an exception or a pattern allowed to persist. The answer reflects more than logic alone. It reveals underlying values, showing how responsibility is assigned and which lives are prioritized for protection. It exposes how vulnerability is recognized or ignored, and how easily silence becomes acceptable. In cases like this, the absence of action carries its own meaning. It shows how society measures the cost of inaction, and how much suffering it is willing to tolerate before accountability is demanded. From a psychological standpoint, the act of sending letters to the police reveals far more than arrogance or provocation. It suggests fragmentation at the core of the offender's identity. This was not merely an attempt to mock authorities. It was an effort to confirm existence. The killer needed acknowledgement, not affection, not understanding, but recognition. At the same time, he feared exposure. This contradiction, wanting to be seen while remaining hidden, is a defining feature of deeply unstable self-concepts. In clinical psychology, this tension often emerges in individuals whose sense of self was never securely formed. Identity instability can develop from early neglect, chronic invalidation, or unresolved trauma. When internal identity lacks cohesion, external recognition becomes essential. Being noticed confirms existence. Being feared confirms power. Yet being fully exposed threatens annihilation of the fragile self. The letters, therefore, were not communication. They were regulation, a way to balance visibility and concealment. The offender did not seek dialogue, he sought asymmetry. He controlled when to speak and when to disappear. This behavior aligns with what psychologists describe as narcissistic compensation, not necessarily grandiosity, but an attempt to stabilize a fractured internal world by exerting dominance over others. Control becomes a substitute for identity. Stoic philosophy offers a useful lens here. Stoics argue that the pursuit of power over others is a sign of inner slavery. A person who requires domination to feel whole is not free. He is governed by unmet desire. Marcus Aurelius wrote that those who seek control externally often lack governance internally. From this perspective, the offender's actions do not reflect strength. They reflect dependence. He was dependent on fear, reaction, and silence to sustain himself. The need to dominate did not arise from confidence. It arose from chaos. Violence became a way to impose order where none existed internally. The careful pacing of the crimes, the restraint, and the calculated communication suggest someone desperately maintaining control over impulses that threatened to overwhelm him. The killings were not explosions. They were containment strategies. Buddhist psychology deepens this understanding by identifying ignorance and attachment to ego as fundamental sources of suffering. When identity becomes rigid, when the self must be preserved at all costs, threats to that identity are experienced as existential danger. Violence, in this framework, is not merely hatred toward others. It is a misguided attempt to defend a self that feels perpetually endangered. The Freeway Phantom's behavior aligns disturbingly well with this model. The letters demonstrate ego fixation. The insistence on being acknowledged without consequence reflects attachment to an image of superiority that could not survive exposure. The suffering inflicted was not incidental. It was instrumental. Others became objects through which the offender stabilized his self-concept. Christian theology approaches the issue from a moral dimension rather than a psychological one. Sin, in this tradition, is not merely a moral action. It is separation from moral truth. It is the refusal to recognize the humanity of others. In this sense, the offender's crimes represent an extreme form of separation. Victims were reduced to means rather than ends, stripped of dignity to serve a disordered will. However, Christian thought also extends responsibility beyond the individual. Silence, when faced with injustice, becomes complicity. A society that fails to protect its most vulnerable does not remain neutral. It participates indirectly in harm. The absence of urgency, The fragmentation of investigation and the limited visibility afforded to the victims reflect a broader moral failure. This case, therefore, cannot be understood solely through the psychology of the killer. It must also be examined through the psychology of institutions. Systems develop personalities. They develop habits of attention and neglect. When certain lives are repeatedly deprioritized, it reveals collective values operating beneath stated principles. If modern investigative tools were applied today, some patterns might finally emerge. Linguistic analysis of the letters could identify personality markers, emotional leakage, or consistent cognitive distortions. Word choice, syntax, and rhythm often betray psychological structure more reliably than content. Social network analysis could map overlooked connections, identifying individuals who moved between neighborhoods unnoticed. Geographic profiling could refine assumptions about residence, work patterns, and transportation access. Advances in behavioral analysis could clarify whether the offender was truly singular or part of a broader pattern of opportunity enabled by systemic blind spots. Yet time has eroded evidence as effectively as the killer once did. Physical traces fade, witness memories degrade, context dissolves. What remains is consequence. The lasting impact of the Freeway Phantom case is not confined to investigative files. It lives in generational fear. Parents taught their children caution not through lessons, but through anxiety. Communities learned silence as a survival strategy. Speaking too loudly felt dangerous. Trust became conditional. A city adapted to loss without justice. That adaptation itself is a psychological phenomenon. When resolution never arrives, people recalibrate expectations. They learn to live with unanswered questions. Over time, this acceptance becomes normalization. Injustice becomes background noise. This is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of all. Not the killer's absence, but the society's accommodation. The case became something that happened, rather than something that demanded reckoning. This leads to a final, uncomfortable question. If justice arrives too late, does it still fulfill its purpose? Or does it become another monument, static, symbolic, disconnected from those it was meant to serve? Justice delayed does more than deny closure. It reshapes moral memory. It teaches future generations what can be forgotten. In the end, the Freeway Phantom case compels a deeper confrontation with the nature of human responsibility. It demonstrates how individual pathology does not operate in isolation, but intersects with collective failure at multiple levels. The violence was not sustained by a single mind acting alone, but by silence, institutional fragmentation, and prolonged neglect. When warning signs are missed and vulnerable lives are deprioritized, harm becomes possible and, once normalized, it becomes repeatable. The killer may never be named, but the conditions that allowed him to exist remain identifiable, and that recognition may be the only form of justice still available. The Freeway Phantom was never arrested. There was no trial, no confession, no moment of reckoning. What remains is absent sand. Absence carries its own gravity. It lingers, presses inward, and refuses to fade. The lack of answers does not dissolve the questions, it sharpens them. Fear becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the unseen face of a killer, but the values of a society that hesitated, overlooked, or underestimated its duty to protect. This case reminds us that some crimes do more than end lives. They expose what is ignored, whose suffering is minimized, and how silence itself becomes an accomplice. In the end, silence speaks louder than any verdict ever could. If this story made you think, feel, or question, take a moment to like, share the video, and subscribe to support this channel. Your engagement keeps these stories from fading into obscurity. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.